At 9:28 p.m. on May 16, 1943, Wing Commander Guy Gibson sat in the cockpit of a Lancaster bomber designated AJG, watching the coastline of Nazi-occupied Holland pass beneath him at 100 feet above the ground. Behind him, in tight formation, flew 18 more Lancasters, each one carrying a bomb that didn't officially exist, designed to destroy targets that were supposed to be indestructible. Gibson had no way of knowing that in exactly 5 hours, 8 of those aircraft would be scattered across Germany in burning wreckage, that 53 of his hand-picked crew members would be dead, that the mission would become the most celebrated air raid of World War II and one of the deadliest failures. The target was 3 dams in Germany's industrial heartland: the Möhne Dam, the Eder Dam, the Sorpe Dam. These massive concrete structures held back billions of gallons of water that powered the factories producing tanks, ammunition, and weapons for Hitler's war machine. Intelligence said the dams were the Achilles heel of German industry. Destroy them, and you cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. There was just one problem: the dams were impossible to destroy. Conventional bombs bounced off the massive concrete walls. Torpedo attacks were prevented by anti-torpedo nets. The dams were protected by flak towers, searchlights, and balloon barrages. Every previous attempt to damage them had failed catastrophically. But British engineer Barnes Wallis believed he had found a solution: a cylindrical bomb weighing 9,250 pounds that would skip across the water like a stone, sink against the dam wall, and detonate at a precise depth, creating a shockwave that would crack the concrete from the inside. The idea was brilliant. It was also insane. The bomb, codenamed Upkeep, had to be dropped from exactly 60 feet above the water while flying at exactly 232 miles per hour, at exactly 425 yards from the dam. Any deviation would cause the bomb to shatter on impact, sink too deep, or skip over the dam entirely. And this had to be done at night, while flying through a valley surrounded by hills, being shot at by anti-aircraft guns. The mission required crews with skills far beyond what normal bomber operations demanded. Gibson was authorized to handpick his men, the best pilots, the best navigators, the best bomb aimers in RAF Bomber Command. He assembled 133 aircrew members and formed 617 Squadron. They trained for 8 weeks on low-level night flying, practicing runs over British reservoirs until they could maintain 60 feet altitude by eye in complete darkness. They didn't know what they were training for. The mission was classified at the highest level. The crews were told only that they were preparing for something important, something that might change the course of the war. On May 15, 1943, Gibson finally briefed the crews on their target. He showed them reconnaissance photos of the dams. He explained the mission profile. He told them this would be the most difficult and dangerous operation any of them had ever attempted. He didn't tell them that Air Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, had calculated expected casualties at 50%. That half the aircraft weren't expected to return. The crews didn't need to be told. They could do the math themselves. Flying at 60 feet through German air defenses, at night, over hostile territory, attacking the most heavily defended targets in the Reich. This was a suicide mission dressed up as strategic bombing. They volunteered anyway. At 9:39 p.m. on May 16th, the first wave of 9 aircraft crossed the Dutch coast flying in 3 groups of 3. Gibson led the first group. His aircraft, a modified Lancaster stripped of most defensive armament to accommodate the massive Upkeep bomb, skimmed across the landscape at 100 feet, below German radar coverage. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in execution. 3 waves of aircraft would attack in sequence. The first wave, 9 aircraft, would target the Möhne Dam. Once that was destroyed, any remaining aircraft would proceed to the Eder Dam. The second wave, 5 aircraft, would attack the Sorpe Dam using a different approach. The third wave, 5 aircraft, would serve as reserves, attacking wherever needed. The aircraft flew in tight formation to protect each other and maintain navigation. At 100 feet altitude, traveling at 200+ miles per hour, in darkness, navigation errors could be fatal. One wrong turn, one miscalculation, and a Lancaster would fly straight into the ground. 20 minutes after crossing the coast, it happened. Lancaster AJB, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Bill Estelle, struck high-tension power lines stretched across the Reichswald forest. The aircraft's wings sheared off. The bomber cartwheeled across the trees and exploded in a fireball that lit up the night sky for miles. 7 men died instantly. The upkeep bomb detonated on impact, creating a secondary explosion that scattered wreckage across half a mile of forest. There was no time to mourn. The formation continued, now reduced to 18 aircraft. At 10:47 p.m. the second loss occurred. Lancaster AJM, piloted by Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood, was hit by anti-aircraft fire while crossing the German border. Tracers ripped through the fuselage, starting fires in the bomb bay. The upkeep bomb's motor was damaged, causing it to spin out of control. Hopgood tried to gain altitude to give his crew time to bail out, but the aircraft was too badly damaged. The fire spread. The bomb spinning created catastrophic vibrations. At 11:08 p.m., AJM disintegrated in midair. The upkeep bomb fell away and detonated on the ground below. The wreckage scattered across German farmland. 6 crew members died in the explosion. The 7th, rear gunner Tony Bircher, was blown clear when the tail section separated. He survived with severe injuries and was captured. 17 aircraft remained. At 12:15 a.m. on May 17th, Gibson's formation reached the Möhne Dam. The target appeared through the darkness like something from an engineering textbook. A massive curved wall of concrete stretching 2,100 feet across the valley, holding back 140 million tons of water. Flak towers positioned on either side of the dam immediately opened fire. Searchlights swept the sky, trying to pin the aircraft in their beams. Gibson began his attack run. He descended to exactly 60 feet above the water, so low that his propellers created spray patterns on the surface. His bomb aimer, Frederick Spafford, watched through his sight as the dam approached at 232 miles per hour. The flak was intense. Tracers crossed the darkness like horizontal rain. 20 cannon shells exploded around the Lancaster. One hit could bring the aircraft down. Spafford waited until the range markers aligned perfectly in his sight, then released the upkeep bomb. The bomb dropped, hit the water, and skipped, once, twice, 3 times, bouncing across the surface like a stone. It struck the dam wall and sank exactly as designed. Gibson pulled up hard, banking away as his rear gunner counted. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The bomb detonated 30 feet below the surface. A column of water 1,000 feet high erupted from the lake. The shockwave was visible, a white wall spreading across the surface. But when the water settled, the dam was still standing. One bomb hadn't been enough. Gibson circled back and ordered the next aircraft in. Lancaster AJM, piloted by Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood. No, AJM was gone. Hopgood was already dead, his aircraft scattered across Germany. Gibson corrected himself. Lancaster AJP, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Harold Mickey Martin. Martin began his attack run. The flak gunners had adjusted their aim, tracking the altitude the bombers were using. Martin flew directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. His bomb aimer released the upkeep at the precise moment. The bomb skipped perfectly across the water and detonated against the dam wall. Another massive explosion. Another column of water reaching toward the sky. The dam still stood. 2 bombs gone. The Möhne dam showed minor damage but remained intact. Gibson ordered the 3rd aircraft in, Lancaster AJA, piloted by Squadron leader Henry Maudslay. But AJA had already been hit during the approach. Flak had damaged the bomb release mechanism. When Maudslay's bomb aimer tried to release the upkeep, it hung up for 3 seconds before dropping. Those 3 seconds were fatal. The bomb released late, skipped across the water and struck the top of the dam wall before detonating, not against the wall as designed, but on top of it. The explosion was catastrophic. The blast wave caught Lancaster AJA as it was climbing away. The aircraft was thrown upward by the shockwave, then fell back toward the water, engines failing, fuselage torn open. Maudslay fought the controls, trying to keep the bomber airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. He managed to climb to 1,000 feet and turned west, trailing smoke and fire. At 12:36 a.m., German radar stations detected an aircraft flying erratically near the town of Emmerich, 60 miles from the Möhne Dam. Flak batteries opened fire. Lancaster AJA was hit repeatedly and exploded in midair. All 7 crew members were killed. Their bodies were found scattered across a half-mile radius. Back at the Möhne Dam, Gibson continued the attack. 16 aircraft remained, but 3 had already expended their bombs with the dam still standing. He ordered Lancaster AJA in next, piloted by Flight Lieutenant David Maltby. Maltby's attack run was textbook perfect. 60 feet altitude, exactly 232 miles per hour, release at precisely 425 yards. The upkeep bomb skipped across the water, struck the dam wall, and sank to the perfect depth. The detonation at 12:49 a.m. created a shockwave that finally overwhelmed the concrete structure. A crack appeared at the center of the dam, spreading rapidly across the face. Then the wall failed. 140 million tons of water burst through the rupture in a wall 100 feet high and moving at 30 miles per hour. The flood swept down the valley below, destroying everything in its path: factories, power stations, bridges, railways, and entire villages. The Möhne Dam had been breached. Gibson radioed the code word back to base: "Nigger." The mission's first objective was achieved, but the cost was already catastrophic: 3 aircraft lost, 21 men dead. And the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead. Gibson led the remaining aircraft with unused bombs toward the Eder Dam, 50 miles southeast. This target was even more difficult, situated in a valley surrounded by mountains, requiring aircraft to dive steeply, release the bomb, then pull up sharply to avoid crashing into the hillside on the opposite side. The approach was so dangerous that even in daylight it would have been considered suicidal. In darkness, it was almost impossible. Lancaster AJL, piloted by Flight Lieutenant David Shannon, made the first attempt. He lined up for the attack run, descended toward the water, and had to abort. The approach angle was wrong. Trying to release the bomb would have sent the aircraft directly into the mountain. He circled and tried again. Second abort. The valley was too narrow, the angle too steep. Third attempt. This time Shannon committed. He dove toward the water, leveled at 60 feet, released the bomb at maximum speed, then pulled up so hard that the Lancaster's wings creaked under the stress. The aircraft cleared the hillside with less than 50 feet to spare. Behind him, the upkeep bomb skipped across the reservoir and detonated against the dam wall. The explosion was massive, but the Eder Dam, even larger than the Möhne, remained standing. Lancaster AJZ, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Les Munro, made the next attempt. No. AJZ had turned back hours ago after being hit by flak over Holland, its radio equipment destroyed. Monroe had made the decision to abort rather than continue without communications. Gibson corrected. Lancaster AJN, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Les Knight. Knight made his attack run. The bomb dropped perfectly, skipped across the water, detonated against the wall. Still the dam held. One bomb remained. Lancaster AJT, piloted by Pilot Officer Warner Otley. No, Otley was dead too. AJT had been shot down over Germany 2 hours earlier. The aircraft had been hit by flak near Ham, caught fire and crashed into a field. All 7 crew members were killed. Gibson had lost track. So many aircraft gone, so many men dead. He had to check his notes to remember who was still alive. Lancaster AJC, piloted by Pilot Officer Louis Burpee, also gone. Shot down near the Sorpe Dam. 7 more dead. The losses were mounting faster than Gibson could process. He forced himself to focus on the mission. 1 bomb left. 1 more chance to breach the Eder Dam. He ordered in the final aircraft. Lancaster AJE, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Les Dingy Young. Young made his approach through the valley, descended to attack altitude, released his bomb with perfect accuracy. The upkeep skipped across the water, struck the dam wall, detonated at the designed depth. At 1:52 a.m., the Eder Dam failed. A section of the wall 250 feet wide collapsed. 202 million tons of water, even more than the Möhne, poured through the breach in a tsunami that swept 20 miles down the valley, destroying hydroelectric plants, rail lines, and bridges essential to German war production. 2 dams destroyed, the mission was succeeding. But the cost was unbearable. By 2:00 a.m., 5 aircraft from the first wave had been destroyed, 35 men dead. The survivors turned west and began the long flight home through German air defenses that were now fully alert. The second wave, 5 aircraft targeting the Sorpe Dam, had fared even worse. Lancaster AJK, piloted by Pilot Officer Vernon Byers, had been shot down near the Dutch coast at 11:50 p.m. The aircraft was hit by flak, caught fire, and crashed into the Wadensee. All 7 crew members drowned. Lancaster AJE had already been mentioned. Young had survived to bomb the Eder Dam. Lancaster AJH, piloted by Pilot Officer Jeff Rice, struck the water during low-level flight over the Zuiderzee. The impact tore the upkeep bomb from its mounts. Rice managed to keep the aircraft flying despite severe damage to the fuselage. But without a bomb, he had to abort the mission and return to base. Only 2 aircraft from the second wave reached the Sorpe Dam. Lancaster AJT, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Joseph McCarthy, and Lancaster AJF, piloted by Flight Sergeant Ken Brown. The Sorpe Dam was different from the Möhne and Eder, an earth-filled dam instead of concrete. The bouncing bomb technique wouldn't work. McCarthy and Brown had to make multiple precision runs along the length of the dam, dropping their bombs to explode against the earth embankment. McCarthy made his attack at 12:46 a.m. His bomb struck the dam and detonated, creating a massive crater in the embankment. But earth-filled dams are designed to absorb damage. The structure held. Brown attacked at 1:14 a.m. Another explosion, another crater. The dam cracked but didn't fail. Without additional bombs, they couldn't finish the job. The Sorpe Dam remained operational. The third wave, 5 reserve aircraft, had been scattered across Germany by navigation errors and mechanical failures. Lancaster AJS, piloted by Pilot Officer Louis Burpee, had been shot down at 12:28 a.m. near the town of Gilsrigen. The aircraft was caught by searchlights and hit by concentrated flak fire. It crashed and exploded, killing all 7 crew. Lancaster AJW, piloted by Flight Lieutenant William Townsend, reached the Inept Dam, a secondary target, and attacked at 3:37 a.m. His bomb damaged the dam but didn't breach it. Lancaster AJY, piloted by Flight Sergeant Cyril Anderson, became lost over Germany and couldn't locate any target. Anderson made the decision to dump his bomb in the North Sea rather than risk flying it back to England. He and his crew returned safely. Lancaster AJC, piloted by Pilot Officer Otley, already gone. Shot down hours earlier. Lancaster AJT, piloted by Pilot Officer Burpee, also gone. By 3:00 a.m., the surviving aircraft were limping back to England. Some had battle damage. All were low on fuel. The crews were exhausted after 5 hours of the most intense combat flying they'd ever experienced. At 3:11 a.m., Lancaster AJN, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Les Knight, was approaching the Dutch coast when it was hit by light flak from a German naval vessel. The shells punctured the fuel tanks. Aviation fuel poured from the wings. Knight tried to gain altitude to give his crew time to bail out, but the aircraft was losing fuel too quickly. The engines began cutting out one by one. At 3:15 a.m., Knight ordered his crew to bail out. 5 men jumped and their parachutes deployed successfully. Knight and his flight engineer, Raymond Grayston, stayed with the controls, trying to keep the bomber level long enough for the others to escape. The Lancaster hit the water at 120 miles per hour and broke apart on impact. Knight and Grayston were killed instantly. Of the 5 who belayed out, 3 drowned when they hit the water. 2 survived and were captured. It was the last loss of the night. At 4:00 a.m., the first aircraft, Gibson's AJG, landed at RAF Scampton. Over the next 2 hours, 11 more Lancasters returned. Some landed with battle damage so severe that ground crews couldn't believe they'd made it home. 8 aircraft didn't return. Of the 133 aircrew who had taken off that night, 53 were dead. 3 were captured as POWs and would spend the rest of the war in German prison camps. The mission was being called the greatest precision bombing raid in history. 2 massive dams destroyed. Severe damage to German industrial capacity. A blow to Nazi morale that proved Allied air power could strike anywhere. But standing on the runway at 6:00 a.m., counting the empty hardstands where 8 Lancasters should have been parked, Gibson couldn't process it as a victory. 53 men dead. Friends he'd trained with, crews he'd personally selected, the best pilots in Bomber Command all gone in one night. The mission was a success. That's what the reports would say. That's what the newspapers would print. That's what the propaganda films would show. But Gibson knew the truth. They had destroyed 2 dams and killed 53 of their own men doing it. In the days after the raid, RAF Bomber Command released carefully edited mission reports to the press. The stories focused on the precision of the attack, the brilliance of Wallis's bomb design, the skill of the pilots who flew at rooftop level through enemy fire. The newspapers called them heroes, the Dambusters, the men who proved that German defenses could be penetrated, that so-called invulnerable targets could be destroyed. What the newspapers didn't report was the human cost downstream from the dams. When the Möhne Dam failed, 140 million tons of water swept through the Ruhr Valley. The flood destroyed 25 factories, 3 hydroelectric plants, 125 factories, and damaged 11 bridges. German war production in the region dropped by 30% for 6 weeks. The flood also destroyed entire villages. Neheim, Wickede, Echthausen, communities that had existed for centuries were wiped off the map in minutes. Homes, schools, churches, all swept away by the wall of water. The German government reported 1,294 civilians killed by the flood. 749 were foreign workers, French, Belgian, and Soviet prisoners forced to work in German factories. They were housed in camps in the valley below the dam. When the flood came at 12:49 a.m., they had no warning and no chance to escape. They drowned locked in their barracks, prisoners to the end. The Eder Dam flood killed an additional 47 people, mostly farmers and villagers living in the valley below. Total civilian deaths from the raid, approximately 1,300 people. This information was classified by the British government for decades. The Dambusters Raid was a propaganda victory. The narrative of brave RAF pilots striking a blow against Nazi Germany couldn't be complicated by discussions of civilian casualties. The crews didn't learn the full death toll until after the war. Some struggled with the knowledge. They had signed up to fight the German military, not to kill civilians and foreign prisoners. Others rationalized it as the cost of war. Germany had bombed London, Coventry, and countless other cities. The Ruhr Valley housed factories producing weapons for the Nazi war machine. Civilian casualties were tragic but inevitable. Guy Gibson never had to fully process these moral complications. He was killed in action on September 19, 1944, when his Mosquito bomber crashed in Holland. He was 26 years old. He had been ordered to stop flying combat missions after the dam's raid. His celebrity made him too valuable for propaganda purposes to risk in combat, but Gibson couldn't stay grounded. He pulled strings to get assigned to missions, lying about his flight status to squadron commanders. The mission that killed him was supposed to be a simple Pathfinder operation, marking targets for other bombers. His aircraft suffered engine failure during the return flight and crashed into the Dutch countryside. Gibson's body wasn't identified until 1947. He was buried with military honors in the Netherlands. His medals included the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. He never spoke publicly about the 53 men who died under his command on the dam's raid. In his autobiography, he mentioned them briefly, names listed in an appendix, casualties recorded as statistics. He couldn't afford to dwell on the dead. There were always more missions to fly. Of the 133 aircrew who flew on the dam's raid, 53 died that night. Of the 80 who survived, 32 more were killed in action before the war ended. The survival rate for RAF Bomber Command was the worst of any Allied military service. Only 27% of aircrew completed their 30-mission tour of duty. The rest were killed, captured, or so severely wounded they couldn't continue flying. 617 Squadron, the Dambusters, continued flying high-risk missions for the rest of the war. They attacked V-weapon sites, sank the battleship Tirpitz, and dropped the first 22,000-pound Grand Slam bombs on German bunkers. They also continued dying. By May 1945, 617 Squadron had lost 181 aircrew killed in action, more than the entire squadron's strength when it was formed. The survivors struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. They had spent years flying through flak over Germany, watching friends die, living with the knowledge that every mission might be their last. Some thrived after the war. They became businessmen, politicians, educators. They attended reunions and told stories about the old days. They were proud of what they'd accomplished. Others couldn't escape the war. They drank to silence the nightmares. They isolated themselves from family and friends who couldn't understand what they'd experienced. Some took their own lives. There was no PTSD diagnosis in the 1940s. Shell shock, battle fatigue, these were things that happened to weak men, not to decorated RAF pilots. The men who struggled were expected to tough it out, to move on, to stop dwelling on the past. Many tried. Most failed. The legacy of the dam's raid is complicated. Militarily, it was a success. 2 dams destroyed, significant damage to German industry, proof that precision bombing could achieve strategic objectives. Tactically, it was questionable. The dams were rebuilt within months. German war production recovered quickly. The mission tied up resources, aircraft, crews, training time. that might have been better used elsewhere. Morally, it raised questions that Britain wasn't ready to answer in 1943. Were civilian casualties acceptable collateral damage? Was destroying industrial infrastructure worth 1,300 civilian lives? What about the foreign prisoners who drowned? Were they victims of the Germans who enslaved them, or the British who bombed them? The British government didn't want these questions asked. The Dams raid was presented as an unqualified triumph. Brave pilots, brilliant engineering, devastating blow to Nazi Germany. The complexity was classified. It took decades for the full story to emerge. Researchers piecing together German records, survivors finally willing to speak about what they'd witnessed. Declassified documents revealing the civilian death toll. By then, most of the participants were dead. The narrative had solidified. The Dambusters were heroes who struck a legendary blow against Hitler's war machine. That narrative isn't wrong. It's just incomplete. 53 men died on the Dams raid. They were volunteers who knew the mission was dangerous. They were the best aircrew in Bomber Command, hand-picked for an operation that would make history. They flew Lancasters at 60 feet above the ground through German flak at night. They dropped experimental bombs with precision that seems impossible even now. They achieved their objectives despite losses that would have broken most units. They were extraordinarily brave. They were also extraordinarily unlucky. Bill Estelle died when his Lancaster hit power lines in the darkness. John Hopgood died when flak set his aircraft on fire. Henry Maudsley died when his own bomb exploded beneath him. Les Knight died keeping his bomber level so his crew could bail out. They died doing something that seemed impossible, attacking the most heavily defended targets in Nazi Germany with bombs that had never been used in combat, using tactics that had never been attempted. The mission succeeded, the dams broke, the flood swept through the valleys, German industry was disrupted, and 53 men never came home. Their names are listed on memorials at RAF Scampton and in Westminster Abbey. Their sacrifice is remembered at annual Dambusters reunions. Their story is told in books, films, and documentaries. But the full truth, the complexity, the moral ambiguity, the questions that don't have easy answers, that took 80 years to emerge. The Dams raid wasn't a simple story of heroism. It was a story of impossible choices, acceptable losses, and strategic priorities that valued objectives over lives. It was 53 men who volunteered for a mission that killed them. It was 1,300 civilians who drowned because 2 dams broke. It was German industry disrupted for weeks before recovering. It was a propaganda victory that Britain desperately needed in 1943. It was all of these things at once. History usually is. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the complicated truths of history every single day. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. These stories don't have simple endings. But they're true and they matter. 53 men died on the night of May 16, 1943. They died as heroes. They also died as statistics in a war that consumed 60 million lives. Both things can be true. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering the Dambusters, all of them, including the ones who never came home.